Lustre-painted pottery represents the highest form of ceramic art in the early Islamic world. We know it would have been a very demanding technology, and it involves taking an already fired glazed vessel, then painting a design on it with a very special paint. A number of recipes exist from medieval times, and also modern analytical work has been undertaken to understand the paint and the process. It involves the application of a paint that contains copper, silver, and other elements, and a further firing undertaken at lower temperature in a reducing atmosphere, which means oxygen cannot enter the kiln. The metal elements fuse to the surface of the glaze. If the temperature is too high, all of the paint will fuse to the glaze. If too low, nothing will happen, and if any oxygen gets into the kiln, the copper and silver will combine with oxygen and vaporize. After firing, what remains of the original paint is a black layer on the surface, which is wiped off to reveal the metallic lustre paint surface below. The earliest lusterwares in the 9th and 10th centuries are known from a number of sites, most especially Samarra, but including sites from across the Middle East and indeed the Old World as a whole. On all of these sites indicated, and on others, I have studied the pottery of the period to try to determine where it was made, when it was made, and how it was made. Prior to the Islamic world, the technologies involving ceramic glazes and the closely related glass industry were spread across the region. Tarsus is known as a centre for making pottery with a flux of lead. This flux enables the silica of the glaze to melt at a low enough temperature for a pottery kiln. There's more about pottery glaze fluxes in episode 17 of this lecture series. Glass-making technology was important in the Levant, especially in Sidon in the Roman period. In Iraq, in the Sasanian period, some have suggested Ctesiphon as a major production centre. The glazed pottery was fluxed with the alkali elements, soda and potash. Some vessels were also coloured turquoise by the addition of copper. Others were colourless. They would have been white when they were first produced, made opaque by crystals that grew in the glaze. However, alkali glazes are prone to decay, and there are very few examples that give us an idea of what the glazes originally looked like. With the conquest of all of these regions by Islam, all these technologies could be brought together in a new synthesis. This synthesis is quickly exhibited in the pottery. This image is from a scanning electron microscope. For more about the methodology, see episode 2 in this series. The degree of intensity of reflectance is created by the molecular density of the elements and the material being analysed. So the body is grey. The glaze is light grey. Minerals like quartz are dark grey. The tin oxides are white, and voids or holes are black. So this is a tin opacified glaze. Petrographic analysis, as outlined in episode 2 of this series, is a technique developed by geologists to study rocks and minerals and can be used to study pottery, in particular to characterize production centres. The Tigris-Euphrates basin has always been the main contender for production of early lusterware. All of the sites on this map are where I have sampled pottery to create a model of what pottery looks like in thin section across the basin. Combined with this model, we have some evidence for production in the Tigris-Euphrates basin in this period. Al-Yaqubi, in the late 9th century, says that potters from Kufa and Basra were brought to Samarra, the palace city founded in 836, and perhaps not for the first time, potters were brought to the foundation of a new city. Al-Jahiz, a native of Basra, says in the 9th century that the Basra pottery colour seems as if it has been moulded out of an egg yolk. In the 10th century, Baghdad is mentioned. There are also vessels with their place of production inscribed on them. including Hira and Basra. Finally, there is kiln evidence from Raqqa and Basra. So here again are those sites. Basra, Kufa and Hira are right next to each other. Baghdad, Samarra and Raqqa. Petrographic analysis of early lustre-painted wares and also the associated glazed pottery has shown only a few distinct petrographically defined fabrics, or petrofabrics. Raqqa has been identified by analysis of pottery from the site. Samarra and Baghdad have been associated with petrofacts that seem appropriate to that area according to the model, aided in Samarra's case by analysis of prehistoric pottery from the site. This petrofabric, for instance, has a range of minerals of the size and shape appropriate for the centre of the Tigris-Euphrates basin, and so is probably the Baghdad fabric. This group of objects made of pottery is presently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The group was donated in 1952 by Mr. N.M. Baker, who found them near Old Basra, 10 kilometres west of modern Basra, according to the record. The noted archaeologist Charles Wilkinson would have been the curator responsible at that time, and it is clear that he realised the significance of the material. A number of these pieces are wasters, which is pottery ruined in the firing and discarded immediately, while the rod-shaped objects are kiln furniture, which are also associated closely with the locations of kilns. Analysis of objects like this enable reliable attribution of a petrofabric with a specific pottery production centre. The only problem with these finds is that we have to rely entirely on Mr. Baker's attribution. This is the petrofabric of those objects that Mr. Baker said he found in Old Basra. It is also the petrofabric of all the lustre-painted wares that may be considered to be of 9th to 10th century date, and also the associated blue painted wares. Although it is not an especially distinctive petrofabric regarding its inclusions, it is very unusual, easily distinguished from the other Iraqi petrofabrics, for it contains none of the inclusions brought down from the Taurus and Zagros mountains. So in order to examine further the relationship between Basra and this petrofabric, why it is so unusual, and if it can be more reliably attributed to Basra, I've been examining the topography of Basra in Google Earth. Here is modern Basra, which in the 9th century was called Ubullah. Here is Az-Zubair, known to be more closely related to the site of 9th century Basra. These are marshlands from a map from the 1970s. Added here are the deposits of the Wadi Batin. This is a relatively unimportant seasonal stream now, but in the last ice age this was a major river stretching across Arabia towards Medina. Here we get a little closer. At this point it is worth adding this standing monument, part of a large mosque from the foundation of the city. From the historical descriptions we may add the measurement from the desert gate across the city, which is 3 miles or 4.8 kilometres. It was said to be much greater in the other direction. Where that green line starts is in Az-Zubair, here photographed on a cloudy day. This British map of 1940 gives a useful plan of the town. Here is the extent of Zubair and the street pattern from the map. This is far too orthogonal a pattern for disorganized organic growth from a central point, the tomb of Az-Zubair, or the tomb of actually Zubair himself, after which the town is now called. It might actually be the organized street pattern of the original Basra. This is the cemetery, which was probably much larger before encroachment by the industrial areas. Cemeteries usually develop outside the gates of major cities, and it is tempting to hypothesize that this cemetery, much larger than is necessary for Az-Zubair, is what remains of the Basra cemetery. Reflecting the orthogonal pattern of Az-Zubair, this would suggest a wall in about this position, with the desert gate at the end of the old road which passes by the large mosque. So that's where the green line starts. This is a map of 1942 which has some useful features such as topographic contours, and it outlines the escarpment between the higher land and the plain. These contours show that Zubair is on higher ground, up to 50 feet or over 15 meters, not 150 meters, 15 meters higher than the floodplain. The name Al-Basra in Arabic means the overwatching, and indeed it seems to have been built on a hill that overlooked the Mesopotamian plain. Another feature worth adding are excavations. Google Earth clearly shows these excavations, which are unpublished work by the Iraqi authorities. On the floodplain are other interesting features, which appear to be salinated canal courses. These form patterns across the floodplain and seem to be the canal system built for a massive plantation built after the foundation of Basra. Some seem more significant than others. One is perhaps the Nar Makil that went towards Baghdad. The pattern would suggest that the line of the modern Basra al-Zubair road was the site of a major canal, the Nar al-Bulla. From the work of my colleagues Andrew Peterson and Alistair Northedge, the remains of walls can be discerned from a 1968 satellite image. Collectively, this would suggest that Basra in its heyday was something like this, at 25 square kilometres. My next question is, where would the pottery works be? The wind direction may help here. This may seem strange to people now, but potteries are smoky, smelly places you would not want to live downwind from. Here we see the pollution from the famous potteries of Stoke-on-Trent in England. However, in the civilized Middle East, it seems the potteries had to be downwind of the occupied areas. Here, for instance, at Damascus, evidence for pottery production is outside the Bab el-Sharqi, on the eastern side of the city, and as you can see from the windrows, the wind comes from the west. Fustat was the pottery quarter of 14th and 15th century Cairo. It is on the south side, and the wind blows from the north. At Raqqa, the wind blows from the west-southwest, and the well-recorded pottery kilns and also glassworks are to the north and east of the city. At Basra, or Old Basra, the wind blows from the west-northwest, which would suggest pottery production to the northeast, to the southeast of the city, rather. I looked around this area on Google Earth for signs of ceramic production and found what appear to be pits. They are similar to these pits, which are actually clay pits for the potteries at Hais in the Yemen, which I have examined personally, but they would not be conclusive evidence that these pits are actually clay pits. This is the distribution of the pits. I did not find anything like them to the north or west of the city. Whether these are the sources of clay for the Basra potters or not, it seems that medieval Basra is built on the deposits of the Wadi Batin. This would certainly explain why this petrofabric is so unlike any other Tigris-Euphrates basin pottery. The only similar petrofabric I have found is in vessels with turquoise glazes like this, which I always thought came from production in the area, but not at the workshops where the lusterwares were made. But if these are pottery clay pits, they probably would be for different workshops using clay from slightly different deposits of the Wadi Batin. It is worth pointing out that this ceramic body is distinctive even without microscopes. Al-Jahiz's description of clay vessels from Basra having a body colour that seems as if it has been moulded out of an egg yolk is true of the fine yellow Basra body found in all lusterwares and blue painted wares, but which is not true of any other fabric I have studied. So at this stage, it might be worth considering the history of this settlement. The Wadi Batin would have been like a natural highway for anyone coming from the interior of Arabia towards Iraq. In 633, one of the first major expeditions of the forces of Islam came in at this point. By 637, Iraq was conquered. In 638, the Caliph then ordered the foundation of two cities to garrison the troops, Basra and Kufa. So before the foundation of Baghdad in 762 and Samarra in 836, these two cities held the wealth of all of Iraq, and at first none of it went to the central coffers in Medina. In the 640s and the 650s, armies from these two cities conquered Iran, and Basra gained the wealth of Iran's wealthiest province, Khorasan. So Basra was not at first a community of merchants, but a wealthy garrison city, one of the wealthiest in the Islamic world. Residents of Basra received a stipend of up to 3,000 silver dirham a month, and the population grew to well over 200,000, possibly many more. Potters need to work and feed their families, and after the conquest of Ctesiphon in 637 they would have been looking to where they could make and sell their pottery. That market would have been Basra and Kufa. Potters would have arrived soon after the official foundation of the city in 638, if not earlier, and it seems improbable that they would not be making glazed wares. Of course, if they also became Muslim, they would also get a stipend, although latecomers would receive as little as 500 silver dirham a month. It's still not something to be sniffed at. So as for the pottery itself, apart from lusterwares, these blue painted wares were also only made in Basra. Like the lusterwares, these are on a tin pacified glaze. Until Basra itself has been more fully excavated, it will be impossible to develop an accurate chronology for the pottery made there. To create a chronology for the pottery, I use seriation, a technique first invented by archaeologist Flinders Petrie in the late 19th century to try to date pottery from prehistoric tombs. He would notice that assemblages of the tombs would often share vessel types with other tomb assemblages. If you can order them, which Petrie did with pieces of card representing each tomb, you can create a sequence, with some vessels coming into fashion and going out. This is one of the well-established relative dating techniques of archaeology. Indeed, is the only recognized mathematical concept to have been developed by an archaeologist. The only thing seriation doesn't tell you is which way up is the sequence, or actually give the sequence absolute dates. In my case, rather than tombs, I have ordered the forms and motifs of the vessels themselves, with some motifs coming into fashion and going out. This makes it possible to create a sequence for the tin opacified wares of Basra. This graphic is just a selection of the typical motifs in only the most typical forms. Accurately drawing the forms in the archaeological method is also an important part of this work, as it enables clear distinctions to be discerned in what otherwise appears to be identical vessels. Here we see a form and motif typical of the first phase. Here is a vessel typical of the next phase of production. This frond is typical of the next phase, here actually on a lusterware. This cross-hatching is typical of the fourth phase, while the V-filled motif is typical of later wares. Once the seriated sequence is developed, it is possible to add dating evidence from excavations and other sources. For instance, at Susa in Iran, the blue painted wares thought by the excavators to have been introduced in about 700 AD. In fact, Phase 1 seems to be almost entirely known only from Susa, part of the Basra sphere of influence since 641, except for one fabric from Bahrain, the seat of one of the governors of the early Islamic world. At this stage, the Basra pottery would not have been a part of international trade as it was in later days, but only for the Basra garrison and their satellites. This is an SEM image of this earliest glaze. You can see the tin is scarce and only found at the interface between the glaze and the body. Apart from the tin, this glaze looks exactly like glazes made in Iraq going back to the Parthians and earlier. Lead has been added with the tin, and so as far as the flux is concerned, this is now a hybrid lead-alkali glaze. At excavations here, the pottery was associated with coins of the 770s, while occupation at Nippur is thought by the excavators to have ended by about 800. This SEM image of a Phase 2 glaze shows the tin oxide particles found throughout the glaze. However, it still looks a lot like a pre-Islamic Mesopotamian glaze. It is only in the later phases that the intense tin opacification is found. The distribution of Phase 2 seems to be wider. After 750, Baghdad was founded, and the importance of Basra was greatly lessened, so finding a market for pottery elsewhere may have been a good business decision, although it still mostly appears to be within the Basran sphere of influence and important administrative centres in Iraq. Other sites continue to provide dating evidence from Phase 3 onwards. From Phase 3 onwards, Basran wares are widespread. By now, the role of Basra as an important trade hub must have been well established, and the products of Basra went everywhere. The actual beginning of this sequence may have started earlier, but we will probably never know the nature of the first Basran pottery without excavation at Basra. Perhaps Phase 1 started earlier than the Susa evidence suggests. Certainly the technology of the glazes, minus the added tin, has a long tradition in Iraq. In about 975, the sequence of luster-painted wares does indeed seem to come to an end, though I think they carried on making other pottery in Basra for some years. It is my belief that the lusterware potters left Basra and started making lusterwares in Egypt. From here, the technology of tin opacified glazes spread to the rest of the world. There is an alternate opinion. This is related to yellow glazes like this one, which also have tin in them, although they have a high lead flux and do not contain alkalis. This one is made in Egypt. The type seems to be made near Aswan. Excavations in Alexandria found related wares dating to the early Islamic period in the 8th century. However, the earliest ones did not actually have yellow glazes. In Egypt, the population was dominated by Coptic-speaking people of the Coptic Church for many years after the Islamic conquest, and I always thought that this indigenous industry may have continued for many years. Indeed, recent excavations near Cairo have dated this general work group of Coptic wares to as late as the 12th century. So far, there's been no evidence provided to support the idea that there was tin in pottery glazes before the idea was imported from Iraq in the late 10th century. A similar yellow glaze was found at Al-Raqqa in Syria. From 796 to 810, the site was a palace city for the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and it's highly possible that potters were brought to the city from Basra to make pottery there, just as they are recorded to have been brought to the palace city of Samarra. The forms of this pottery made at Raqqa will be equal to Phase 3 of production at Basra, so were made long after the beginnings of tin opacification in Basra itself. The tin opacified glazes of Basra have the best evidence of chronological precedence and have a demonstrated development from alkali glazes. All tin opacified glazes from subsequent times across the Middle East and Europe, and also the Americas, would continue the Basra tradition of fluxing their glazes with alkalis, and then adding lead with the tin. It is likely that production of high lead tin yellow glazes were the result of influence from the Basra tradition without transmission of the full technology. Thank you.